Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back after lunch. Let me get straight into this presentation. My presentation has a long outline, but it is quite deliberate, so that I take you through this roadmap of what we as an industry representing the Malaysian Biodiesel Association think about biodiesel in the palm oil mix as well as the vegetable oil mix. So this presentation would take you through a very macro view of what is the global crude petroleum scenario. I think it's important for us to know where we stand vis-a-vis crude petroleum. We also look closer to home as to what is the Malaysian crude petroleum scenario and how global oils and fats, meaning vegetable oils and fats, fare vis-a-vis crude petroleum, and what specifically is the position of palm oil vis-a-vis other oils and fats, and closer to home, what is Malaysia and Indonesia's position in the oils and fats export trade, and a projection up to 2025 to give you an idea of where the supply-demand scenario is. And the next point is, where does biodiesel fit into this supply-demand scenario? And to give you an update on where we are as of 2014 with respect to global biodiesel. A word about current status. You have heard enough about Malaysian biodiesel mandates, but I'd like to update you. Indonesian biodiesel implementation is at a very critical phase now, so I give you some updates about that as well. And then what we as an industry would like the Malaysian biodiesel implementation program to look like. So to speak, it is our wish list. We hope it comes true. I'd then like to take you through some numbers. It's very important. Quite often, we in the industry have always been asked, what is the level of subsidy that you are asking for this industry to survive? In short, we are asking for no subsidy, and you will see why from my presentation. It's important to recognize that the biodiesel industry has a role to play in climate change, and I'd like to put some numbers as to what the impact of this climate change would be if we adopt the right biodiesel strategy. Many of us don't know that biodiesel is also a lubricity additive, and this has also an economic impact when it comes to diesel pricing, and I'll take you through that as well. And then I'd like to highlight, going forward, how does biodiesel become a main driver for the price of CPO? While talking about all this, another question that is always asked of us is, if CPO price goes up because of the biodiesel scenario, what happens to the oleochemical industry? I think it's a very pertinent question, so I'd like to throw some light on what might happen in the various scenarios that we look at for the oleochemical industry. And while talking of the oleochemical industry, both CNO and PKO are important in the oleochemical industry. Therefore, from a biodiesel perspective, what is done in Philippines by way of crude methyl ester production is important for us to know what might happen to this raw material in terms of the Philippines biodiesel implementation plan. And both the oleochemical industry and the biodiesel industry has a very useful byproduct, and that's glycerin. 10% of biodiesel is glycerin. So how does the oleochemical market, and very specifically the glycerin market, look like with respect to what might happen to biodiesel? And then I'd like to summarize a list of recommendations or a wish list from the industry for the consideration of all stakeholders present in this room, especially the government of Malaysia, and then conclude my presentation. So let's look at the global crude petroleum scenario. You will notice that the world has changed in terms of how crude petroleum is produced and marketed. You find a very surprising player in this mix. If you see, we have USA as the leading producer, something that was not expected a few years back of crude petroleum. There are about 3 or 4 countries that dominate the crude petroleum scenario. What I'd like you to make note is the figure for Malaysia in green. We are only 0.7% of the total crude petroleum produced. Just keep that figure in mind as we go through this presentation. Therefore, Malaysian crude petroleum as well as Malaysian diesel production is an insignificant portion of both global crude and diesel market. We are only 0.8%. From all the analysis that I have read through media and otherwise, I'm told that at $105 a barrel, the petroleum industry's contribution to government revenue is about 31%. Now you can imagine at $45 a barrel, what would happen to the Malaysian government revenue at $45 a barrel. I think everybody can guess which direction that would go. Now, if you look at global oils and fats versus crude petroleum, we are only 5% of the crude petroleum market. We have to use this in perspective when discussing about this industry because we are not a big player when it comes to the fuel market. However, within the vegetable oil market, we are indeed very significant. For a total global exports of about 80 million, 61 million of that is constituted by a production from palm oil, which constitutes 56% of total oils and fats export, and our three nearest competitors together only contribute 27% of that export market. Now, this is an interesting statistic as I build the story towards how biodiesel could play an important role in the palm oil mix. Zooming in to Malaysia and Indonesia, if we now take the palm oil market, then we become a very significant player. We are 90% of global palm oil exports together. We are 50% of global vegetable oils and fats export. And that's a significant number. Moving fast forward to 2025, this is a projection by Oil World. Oil World expects the growth in the four major oils and fats from the year 2015 to 2025 to be about 57 million tons. Out of this 57 million tons, 32 million tons would come from palm oil. That's 56% of the total growth expected in oils and fats. Keep this figure also in mind as we go through this presentation. You heard from Tan Sri Yusuf this morning, the world population is increasing. I have extrapolated a data from FAO to see that it's expected that the per capita consumption of oils and fats is going to increase by about 8 kilos by 2025. For an estimated 8 billion people in the world, this would mean we would require an additional 64 million tons of oils and fats. But you saw from my earlier slide, what is expected by way of growth in the four major oils and fats is only 57 million. So where does that scenario take us to? Zoom in now to the biodiesel scenario. In 2014, the world produced about 30 million tons of biodiesel, out of which palm methyl ester constituted the biggest portion, which is 9.3 million tons, which is 15% of the total palm oil produced. And that's a significant number and has a huge bearing on what the price of CPO would be. It's also interesting for you to notice that we are not indeed the leaders in terms of percentage utilization. Look at rapeseed methyl ester. It's 23% of the total rapeseed production. And soybean methyl ester is about 17% of soybean oil production. These are the top 15 countries. Out of a total of 30 million tons of biodiesel produced, these top 15 countries together account for about 26 million tons, led by USA, and you can see the rest. The next slide, I'd like to zoom in on Asia. If you look at Asia, Indonesia is obviously the leader at 10% volume percentage mandate, followed by Malaysia, Philippines, and so on. But on the right-hand side table, please look at number 12, Colombia, a very small country and a palm-producing country, has already embarked on B10, and very successfully so. If I'm not mistaken, for about 1 million tons of palm oil that they produce, they consume over 600,000 tons of that CPO in biodiesel. You heard about the current biodiesel status. We have moved from B5 all the way down to B7. This is a good initiative by the government. These are pictures from the various launches that we have had in Peninsular Malaysia. And today, we have B7 implemented right across the country. We are, as you heard from YB Minister, we are now working towards a B10 program for which a provisional standard has already been done. A working group led by the Malaysian Palm Oil Board has been discussing with various stakeholders, and we in the industry would like B10 to be tried out first, at least in the industrial sector, and there is already a voluntary incentive scheme that is being offered since 2013. Now look at Indonesia's biodiesel implementation plan. I must say this is rather ambitious. Until very recently, in my personal opinion, this was not a workable plan simply because their model of pricing was built on MOPS gas oil. And you heard when gas oil prices came tumbling down to $450 a ton at about $45 per barrel for crude oil, there is no parity between palm biodiesel and gas oil. And very rightly so, the Indonesian government decided to subsidize this industry by 4,000 rupiah per liter, which works out to roughly 1,295 ringgit per ton. That's a whopping subsidy, and I calculated from the latest announcement by Indonesia that they are willing to subsidize 1.74 million kiloliters of biodiesel in the coming year. That translates to a subsidy of about 1.93 billion ringgit per annum. That is Indonesia's commitment to the biofuel industry. If you fast forward Indonesia's biofuel plan all the way to 2025, you will notice by 2025, if they do implement their program, they will mop up 26 million tons of CPO. So what we as an industry expect for the Malaysian biodiesel? We believe that we should quickly extend the B7 to all sectors and not hesitate to launch B10. Even at B10, when you look at 2.7 million tons of capacity within MBA members, we would only utilize 37% of that capacity. But if we go to B20 by 2016, this is our wish list, we would utilize 74% of our capacity. I'd like just to highlight that contrary to what most people think, from January 2013 until October 2014, implementing biodiesel has actually resulted in a saving. Most people think that this is a heavily subsidized industry, quite to the contrary. However, from November to January 2015, the crash in crude oil price has been so steep that we are now at a slight premium over gas oil, and therefore there is a added cost. But now that we have taken away the subsidy from the market and the fuel market has been liberalized, what it means is for every $10 per barrel, the cost of Malaysian diesel per liter would go up by 27 Malaysian cents. Now imagine that in a scenario where there is so much of volatility in the crude oil market. As compared to that, the next few slides I'd like to show you what we should be doing in terms of biodiesel. Now here is one scenario. You see the basis that I have used for this slide is a CPO price of 2,300 ringgit per ton. And if you see the first two columns, those two columns are given past historical data, what would be the price of CPO for a given price of crude oil. So you can see it goes at $40 per barrel, it's about 1,900 ringgit per ton, to $120 a barrel, it is 2,783. That being the scenario, if at 2,300 ringgit, which is today's scenario, we have a diesel standard which is Euro 2. The government has been planning to launch Euro 4 and Euro 5. I'd say this is the best opportunity for us to launch Euro 5 because Euro 5 is a low sulfur diesel, and when the sulfur content in diesel goes down from 500 ppm today as low as 10 ppm, you will find there is a need for lubricity additive. Although we don't have petroleum company figures, but from our own data, we suspect the cost is going to go up by 20 cents a liter. If that is the scenario, then you can see from this table that whether it is B7, B10 or B20, in various scenarios, we are actually going to save money and therefore there is no need for subsidy. So quite contrary to what most people think, this is definitely a workable plan. I fast forward to a scenario where CPO is 2,800 and you will see a similar analysis. Why I highlight that yellow row is just to give you an indication that until very recently when we were in a subsidized regime, Malaysian consumers anyway were paying 2.1 ringgit per liter. So what I'm trying to highlight is even if crude oil were to go back to $70 per barrel and you had B10 implemented, your price in this market scenario would be 2.13 ringgit per liter, a very feasible number for the Malaysian market. If the price goes to 3,300, and we hope and pray it does go to this figure because it benefits the palm oil industry, again, you see this cost analysis. I won't touch on this scenario, this is academic, to say what would happen if CPO were 1,800. It will never happen. We all know the leverage that biodiesel has on taking away stock of CPO, and therefore this scenario won't happen. But I put it here just for you to get an understanding that in no matter what price scenario you look at, this is a workable and feasible plan. This is a chart I think you heard from Tansri, so I will skip this. The crude oil per barrel follows the gas oil as well, and you see there is a decoupling when the crude oil price has crashed. Now this is where I'd like to spend a little bit of time. If you see, from 2010 is when the world's biodiesel scenario has really gained momentum. And you see a very strong correlation year-on-year stock as reported by MPOB with price. And I plot this on a model to forecast price. And my model basically says that if you were to move from B7 to B10, we could increase the CPO price by 230 ringgit a ton. But if you move from B7 to B20, we displace 1.3 million tons, and we could potentially increase the price of our CPO by a whopping 1,730 ringgit per ton. So that is the kind of leverage that biodiesel can have on our price mechanism. I have already alluded to this, that as a lubricity additive, when you go from Euro 2 to Euro 4 or Euro 5, with the addition of biodiesel, you take away the need to add lubricity additive, and to that extent, you actually save money. So, what does all this mean in terms of GDP contribution to Malaysia? Even when you talk about $45 per barrel, which given the current scenario with not so many weather factors playing a part, probably CPO price would have been 1,900 ringgit. But as I explained from the earlier price forecast model, if we were to implement B10, we could move this price from a base of 1,900 to 2,130, or if we were to move to B20, we could probably move the price to 3,630. So if we fast forward this biodiesel scenario from 2014 to 2025, and my assumption is we can't control what SME or RME does, and therefore I have not changed those numbers. But just implementing the biofuel program of Indonesia and Malaysia, we would start consuming approximately 32.1 million tons in 2025. That would actually become 34% of total oil palm production. And you saw the earlier scenario where food demand itself is difficult to cope. Imagine taking out 22.8 million tons out of this total 57 million ton production would be mopped up by both Malaysia and Indonesia for their biodiesel mandate. Therefore, I say, what would this mean in terms of price for CPO? Anybody's guess, but I think maybe we are looking at a figure of 3,600 ringgit per ton. I'm sure a lot of people in this audience are happy. If now we look at this scenario and understand that yes, biodiesel implementation is feasible, you don't need subsidy, it's good for climate change, it's good for planters, it's good for biodiesel industry, it's good for government, it's good for the consumers. Then what happens to the oleochemical industry? Now we know that if the price moves up to 2,130 at B10 or an impact of 230 ringgit, nothing happens to the biodiesel industry, the oleochemical industry, pardon me. And you must know that many multinationals have formulated their products using green raw materials. I don't think it is prudent on the part of any multinational to take a knee-jerk reaction and say, sorry, the price is too high, I want to change my formulation. I think it sends a wrong signal to the market, and I don't think global CEOs of such major multinationals would take that step, which means this is not an elastic demand. This is a situation where they have to live with these formulations, and I dare say that if crude oil settles at $80 to $100 a barrel, and even if CPO were to be 3,600 ringgit per ton, if you remember the end of 2010 and early 2011, this is precisely what our scenario was, where CPO was around that figure and crude oil was about $80 a barrel, our oleochemical industry did survive. And therefore, I feel that this will not affect very much. A word about climate change. Malaysia has a target to reduce its greenhouse gas 40% from a baseline of 2010. And that translates to approximately 200 metric tons of CO2, million tons of CO2 equivalent. Now, just B20 alone would reduce 6 million tons of CO2 equivalent. Coupled with the methane capture in the palm oil mills, which is about 16 million, the combined total of this as a contribution from the palm industry, we would be able to reduce or meet 30% of our total GHG reduction target. Now, that's a significant number. I have read a McKinsey report. It's very difficult to estimate what's the cost of mitigating GHG emissions. And this McKinsey report, of course, for the US market says that per metric ton of CO2, it's about $50 US. And I just put that number to what we might achieve by way of reduction from the palm industry. That's a huge amount. It's 4 billion ringgit by way of GHG reduction. Now, this is over and above what I stated as obvious reasons for price increase of CPO. A word about coconut and PKO production, specifically from an oleochemical perspective. The world produced about 3.5 tons of coconut oil and 6.3 tons of palm kernel oil last year, out of which you can see who the key players are. But I just want to move to Philippines because this is the only country that uses coconut methyl ester as biofuel. By 2025, they would take away 1.05 million tons of coconut for biodiesel. Now, given the fact that you are working with a very small denominator, 1.05 is 32% of CNO production in the Philippines. And that's significant. You have just seen a typhoon affecting Philippines has been so bullish to the price of PKO. Now, the prices of coconut oil and PKO and CPO move in tandem. However, the differentials depend on supply and demand for this market. The useful byproduct of glycerine, you can see today the world produces more glycerine from biodiesel than from oleochemicals. And therefore, imagine if the biodiesel production were to either go up or down, this could have a significant effect on glycerine market in terms of price, and therefore a significant effect on the profitability of an oleochemical business. So in summary, ladies and gentlemen, what we as an industry want is that Malaysia should acknowledge that we are indeed a small player in the petroleum market, and that we should conserve our petroleum reserves for as long as we can. Capitalize on our dominant position in the oils and fats market, implement B10 right away. Don't let the CPO price drop. Extend it using the existing price formula, which provides a floor support to the industry. Advocate launching of Euro 5 because it is in our interest to have a cleaner environment. Implement BTEC 20 across all sectors. And let's not project the biodiesel implementation strategy as a strategy to prop up price. It's a strategy to address climate change and energy security. If the whole world, and especially the developed world, can do this, who stops us as a developing nation from using this to our advantage to say we are indeed serious about climate change and energy security? Let's stop being a price taker in the petroleum market. Let's move to being a price maker in the oils and fats market. Indeed, we can do this if we have a good strategy in place. Overall, what this means, ladies and gentlemen, is that we build a robust and sustainable biodiesel industry. I'm sorry to say many people think biodiesel industry is a parasite. We are not. We don't ask for subsidies. We have a model in place that supports the existing palm industry. Please treat us as one, and let's work together in building this as a sustainable industry. Therefore, in conclusion, the current crude oil price means it could limit global biodiesel production. Because of the parity between gas oil and palm oil not existing and all the tariff and non-tariff barriers, today we have a zero export market. So what do? If we have to make a significant contribution to GDP, both Malaysia and Indonesia must go full throttle on their biodiesel program. And the world over, biodiesel will be, has been, and will forever be a program dictated by government mandates, whether we like it or not. The increased use of CME in Philippines might put a little bit of pressure on CNO prices, and I said the global glycerine market could also be seriously affected with biodiesel. With that, I thank you for your attention. Thank you very much.